This episode, I'm joined once again by writer and theologian Kevin Hart to discuss his book, Contemplation, The Movements of the Soul. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast going into the new year, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, I hope you all have a very Merry Christmas tomorrow, and please enjoy. So, Kevin Hart, Merry Christmas, and thanks for joining me on Hermitix podcast once again.
Yes, Merry Christmas. Lovely to be
here. We are going to be discussing your book, Contemplation, The Movements of the Soul. This was published by Columbia University Press this year, middle of this year, I think, June it was first released. And this is a work on contemplation, again. It's a shorter work. It is engaging with, once again, the history of contemplation, but what contemplation also is in other traditions as in relation to the Christian tradition. But it's also far more, it seems to have it explicitly has an air of practicality, as if it's somewhere between theory and practice, as if someone could pick it up if they were looking to understand a bit and then go off and undertake some contemplation. Am I somewhat right in that description?
Yes, I think that's right. I'd written the long book, Lands of Likeness, and given that as a series of lectures in Glasgow. And then when I was on sabbatical in rural France last year, Columbia University Press suggested that I write a little book for them. And I wrote it on contemplation because there were many things that I hadn't been able to take up in the bigger book, and I wanted to put out there. And I wanted to write a book that perfectly ordinary folk who wouldn't read an academic treatise could be able to read. People who are commuting to work, who might want to find out something about contemplation, or people in parishes or small groups. Anyone, really. It should be completely able to be read by any literate person, and they can find out a bit about how to contemplate and a bit about the tradition of contemplation.
Well, that brings me to a couple of questions I've outlined actually before we go into the book and even into the title, because I'm just interested on your opinion on this, because I think it's the foundation that many such books, especially when it comes to practical spiritual matters, are maybe against, which is the notion that we're disenchanted. That may very well be a myth, but firstly, do you believe that we're disenchanted? Because many people will willy-nilly say that as if it's all accepted. And then secondly, if we're not, then what do you make of this myth that we all apparently agree upon?
I think the myth of disenchantment depends a lot on where you actually live. I live in the United States. Indeed, I live in the southern part of the United States. Christianity is massively in the majority. You can hardly walk around the corner and not find a church, often a Baptist church. It's like being in England, where you can't walk around a corner without encountering a pub. So I don't see there's a sense of disenchantment here. There's certainly a sense of disenchantment in Europe, without a doubt. If it impinges in the United States at all, it's that there's disenchantment during the week, and people try to recover from the disenchantment on Sundays, or Saturdays if one's Jewish. And the disenchantment comes, I think, from our daily lives being utterly consumed with busyness and with the media and with screens, so that people don't have 5 minutes to themselves to reflect. And when they do have a little time to reflect later in the day, it's taken up with another mode of sociality, and usually drinking to calm oneself down from what's been going on in the day. So I think a lot of it has to do with our culture of speed and of the culture of visuality and busyness.
So do you think enchantment is somewhat, maybe not exactly synonymous, but is always in a relationship, always in a discussion with solitude and silence?
Yes, I think that, as the poet Thomas Tranströmer said some years ago, the human being needs 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the evening, minimally, of complete solitude to detox from the day, to prepare oneself for the day and then to detox for the day. And that can be listening to music, it can be morning, evening prayer, it could be reading poetry, it can be just going for a walk around the block. But I think we have a hunger for some kind of solitude every now and again.
What are we turning into as a mass if we don't engage in that on a consistent basis?
Well, we lose our sense of self for a start. The I becomes completely pervaded by the they. People I've noticed in America are completely preoccupied with lives other than their own, such as exemplified in Hollywood or on the political stage, and even in the university world where I belong. People are always attracted by a certain kind of academic style elsewhere, and they won't develop their own. So people do this even in terms of clothing and in attitude and in vocabulary, that people seem to have developed a great fear of being themselves.
Dare I ask then, what is it to be yourself?
Okay. Let me say this. In one of the theological traditions that interests me, the Franciscan one, strong idea that each person is created in order to illumine one facet of God. And if one doesn't become oneself in a state of grace, that facet of the divine life is never illuminated in history. And so one is closing off an avenue for people to see something of the divine. So, when we become ourselves, it's ourselves and not ourselves. It's ourselves as we were intended to be by God when we were created. And we have an inescapable tendency, it seems to me, to deviate as quickly as possible from that ideal and become something else.
That's very sort of, of course, it was a Franciscan idea, as you said, but it reminds me of sort of Tolkien's notion of good and evil, in the sense that evil can't create anything of its own, and it's only ever a mutation of the light. And so I'm thinking there, if one's choice in contemplation in being themselves is to illumine, as you say, one facet of God, in not illuminating it, where it's not like there's another choice, where we only sort of, in not engaging in that, we only sort of muddying a possibility. There isn't some other possibility.
Right. One ends up giving some kind of false projection of another person you probably don't even know. You imitate someone else or what the crowd you're in thinks is an ideal. And so you never really develop yourself. You never welcome your own strangeness, as it say. And it seems to me that's something that would be a good thing for teachers to be able to do, that we should nurture our own strangeness. That doesn't mean to say to become willfully eccentric, but it does mean to be different from other people if that's where one is headed.
So one shouldn't be normal. To not contemplate, not engage with this, you end up being normal, which is maybe not bad, but it's lukewarm.
Right. I mean, it's lots of people have said it. You would know this at least as well as I do, that it's one's own life to live. And by the time you're on your deathbed, what you want, minimally, is to have lived your own life. And what a shame it would be if you haven't done that, if you've been imitating someone else.
Mm. Would you say this is, in this Franciscan step towards illuminating one aspect of God, that's an engagement with the soul, and elsewhere is engagement with the self, even though one still of course has a self, but maybe a split there between self and soul being something more?
Right. Well, I was saying just the other day in class that what we actually need today is a good theology of the soul, a modern theology of the soul, because we don't have one. We have the word, but the word is just a place marker. It doesn't seem to do anything. In the history of Christianity, the word soul and the word mind are often interchangeable. Bonaventure, a Franciscan, has a remarkable book called the Itinerarium Mentis in Deum. If you go and get an ordinary translation of it from a bookstore, it might have the title, The Soul's Journey to God, as though you've just got a bus ticket or to the church and can go to the station marked God. In fact, the Latin means the mind's journey into God. That when you engage in the contemplation of God, you don't come to a border of God, somewhere close to him. You are entering the deity. And that seems to me a very important point, and one which is not often seen.
Is that what is that what you think of when you hear the word soul? Is this medieval form of, the highest thing for medieval contemplation was this unity, this unification of the soul with God? Is that what springs to mind?
Okay, well, in contemplation, I think, in Christian contemplation, there's a wide spectrum of results, of which union is the highest. There's many states of contemplation for the rest of us who aren't great saints or mystics, where contemplation does a lot of good, just in one's ordinary daily life, even so that in America, at least, it permeates down to the medical establishment. You go to the doctor, and if your blood pressure is too high, or you suffer from anxiety, it may be that you get prescribed, as it were, a course in mindfulness, which is a mode of meditation. And that is not a bad thing, because it often helps people get off unnecessary medications. It often leads people to live richer, more attentive lives. But there's no sense there that it's leading them necessarily to union with God.
I'm drawn to a question that I had because I feel it'd be a good place to bring it in, because it gets a mention in your book. This is the famous Delphic oracle, Know Thyself. And so here we seem to already have a difference in history between, as you were mentioning there, this mindfulness meditation, forms of knowing thyself, the difference between self and soul. So how would you begin to differentiate, as your book is engaging with this question of not just Christian contemplation, but also at times putting it up, against other forms of other religious contemplation? Maybe we could begin with the Delphic oracle, the famous Know Thyself, which was extremely important pre-Christianity. How would you differentiate that between that and Christian contemplation?
Yes, that's a very good question. One can go back, I think, to the treatment of this very question in the 12th century by Bernard of Clairvaux. And he has a remarkable little book called 5 Books on Consideration, which was sent to the Pope Eugenius III, who had been one of his monks at Clairvaux. And there Bernard draws a really interesting distinction between consideration and contemplation. Now, contemplation is what happens when you fully possess certitude. But consideration is a way of helping us gain certitude. And he says that it's a spiritual exercise, thereby how we come to know ourselves. And way in which we do this is we meditate upon, have I done all that I should do for those who are beneath me, those I'm in charge of? My children and my students, I suppose, and people like that for whom I'm charged with a certain responsibility. Have I done all that? And then you ask, have I done all that's required of me for my peers? Have I done all that I should do for my wife, my siblings, my fellow professors, my friends? and so on for those who are above me? And ultimately, have I done all that I need to do for God? If you ask this in a penetrating way, you get a 360-degree view of the self. And you start to understand yourself much better and your own particular modes of evasion. And it's a helpful thing on the way to gaining certitude about the relationship between oneself and God.
It seems arguably it almost seems this process of consideration seems actually a little bit close to Buddhism in the sense that you're ceaselessly giving yourself up. Have I done each for everything, and then finally at the end all has been done. You're no longer desire, attachment, and so in doing that, but I guess the end result would be far different for some reason.
Right. I think in the Christian way of thinking about this, it's the proper ordering of desire, so that I haven't taken all my desire and placed it directly into myself or into or to those above me. That I've become a workaholic, which is so common in the United States, and I haven't taken account of my family and those who rely upon me. So it's really a matter of the well-ordering of desire.
So you mentioned that there was, and there always is, it seems, in your work, a lot of directionality. You mentioned there are 360 with consideration. We might maybe argue that contemplation is a singular direction, though it probably doesn't seem like that at the time.
Cool.
What role, before we get perhaps specifically to the title, the movements of the soul, why is it, if I'm right in what I've said there, that you find directions so helpful with regard to one's individual theological journey?
Well, I think the very nature of being human is that our consciousness is outwardly directed, intentionality, as we call it technically, and we're directed toward the world around us and other people, of spheres interacting with other spheres of consciousness. And we're directed also temporally, always towards our death, and if one's a believer, towards the judgment of one. And the two things definitely interact. We should interact with the world, have our intentional relationships with the world in particular ways, not just be blown around by circumstance, not be blown around by lack of control, lack of discipline.
Dare I say, you sound like a Heideggerian.
I have my moments. They're usually my...
So what are these movements of the soul?
Okay, yes. I thought when I was writing this book in France last year, Columbia University Press wanted me to have a subtitle, The Art of Stillness, which I fully understand, because there is a sense in which contemplation does lead one to slow down and to rest in the center of one's being and to be still. And it is an art that you can learn to some extent. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought there was value in recovering the ancient view of contemplation in Christianity, that this goes back to Pseudo-Denis the Areopagite, that there are three movements of the soul. The linear movement, which is discursive, where we think rationally from A to Z. The circular movement, when we spin around something and look at it from all sides. And the spiral movement, where we start with something and associate other things that are related to it and go on a spiral. And I think Denis was right in this, that our souls, when we are approaching God, will try to do all of these things. We don't get necessarily very far in a linear, rational mode. We can go some direction in that. Philosophy offers us a number of ways. But when we're contemplating in a stricter sense, we're following a circular motion, and we're often engaging in a spiral motion. And that's what keeps us, creatures of time, able to contemplate, because it's very hard to contemplate in the human condition simply on one intentional object for a very long time. We need to go around it or to associate it with other things.
We love linearity, though. It's so comfortable.
It is. You know exactly where you are.
But it also never ends because you're always picking up new ones. I'm interested in something you said there, that it's contemplation is an art. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of Turner's painting, which has a sort of circular paintbrush stroke. It's his most famous one, the barge. With the barge is almost like a black smoking mass in the middle of the painting.
Right. At sunset, I think, is it?
Yeah. But the reason I think of that when you mentioned that contemplation as an art is that in Turner, not only do we see a lot of movement, but there's a flow that is very sort of ghostly, haunting, liminal, something's being carried along, but he adds in these moments, a great big red buoy or this black barge. And I just feel, as you said, it's an art and not a theory and not a set system or a practice. Do you feel also, like much visual art, there are also these, in contemplation, there are elements like Turner's paintings where something else has to intrude to bring the whole practice alive? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes good sense. You can go into any bookshop, perhaps especially in the United States, and pick up books of how to contemplate, how to meditate. And they serve a certain purpose, but we could call much of what they are concerned with the craft of contemplation. Mm-hmm. They will teach you the bones of what to do. And some of those things are surprising for modern people, and they need to be said. But once you start to contemplate, then it's something that you're doing with your own genius to some extent. There's a cooperation of you and God in the act, but it is a cooperation of you and God, not other people. And so it's drawing upon the creativity that each of us has, which in Christianity is accommodated when we talk about the imago Dei, the image of God within ourselves. If we have the image of the Trinity within ourselves, and the Trinity is that which creates, we have the ability to create as well. And we are creative in our relationships one with another, or we should be, and we are creative in our relationship with God, or we should be. We can't have a neutral relationship with God. It must be a loving relationship with God, and love of its very nature is creative and dynamic. So yes, I think it is an art.
But we often get love wrong. Very wrong.
The whole history of the human race, isn't it? Yeah, we get it wrong. When we think of love in the Christian sense, it's a higher and demanding sense of love, agape, which means self-sacrificial love. And we perpetually, in our ordinary relationships, one with another, we sentimentalize love. And in our relationships with God, we badly sentimentalize love. We have a hard time of it in English, where we just have the one word, love. In Greek, there are several words for it. In Latin, there are several words for it. And so we tend to collapse all these different senses into one and get very muddled.
What term do you think we more often than not mean when we say love commonly? Eros?
Yeah, I think generally we think of eros, and we think of eros as emotion. And this is why over half of American marriages fail within the first year or two, because it's merely an emotion and it's merely erotic. I don't want to downplay the erotic. Far from it. It's extremely important. It was a great gift to us, but it is not the only thing which keeps relationships going, human to human or human to God. That love is also, apart from being an emotion and a disposition, it's also an act of the will. Not that we can force things, but that we have to move the will to the intellect to actually see what a loving act is.
It's interesting to think about. You mentioned there human to human love and human to God love, and I immediately think, well, there's a distinct difference. And as you've been talking about love, I think of that quote by Jacques Lacan, which I think, his typical coy way, it is very smart, where he says, to love is to give what you don't have.
Mm-hmm.
And so someone
who doesn't need it.
Human to human, I think, in terms of what we're talking about with theology, human to human love, there's conditions, there's rife with conditions on both sides. This difficulty of communication. But the strange thing, I guess, when it comes to human to God is one side is unconditional. So
yeah,
what does that... That's a strange thing to think about.
Yeah, I mean, well, love in and of itself should be unconditional. God's love for us is certainly unconditional. God himself is unconditioned. And as Aquinas points out very beautifully in the prima pars of the Summa Theologiae, God loves the world into being. He doesn't make the world like a craftsman. That's something you get in Plato. He loves the world into being by putting himself into a relationship with what he creates. When we love one another, I mean, we can't, if you get married, the wedding ceremony can't say anything like, I will love you on these conditions. Or I would love you only for 5 years and then, let's reconsider and see. That's starting to happen in the way about marriage. It's my first marriage. It's a trial marriage. I don't expect it to go on forever. Or whatever that is, it's not love. But we have you're quite right in putting your finger on the point about the relationship, the asymmetric relationship we have with God, because we have a particular kind of love, which is created, and we hope creative. And when we love God, we love in exactly the same way as we love our spouses, our children, our friends, our parents, but at the limit. Where it overrides everything else. Now, is that unconditioned? Well, if so, it's unconditioned only when it does reach the limit. Or you can't love God in the same way that you love your uncle. You have to have your whole life at stake in the act of love. They might get much closer to how one loves one's spouse or one's children, but with God it goes even a little bit further. But it's still asymmetric because we are massively conditioned beings. We're conditioned by our mortality. We're conditioned by our place in history, by our health, by our desires, and so on and so forth. God doesn't have those constraints.
So from that acceptance, what do we get wrong about God's love?
We sentimentalize it, as I said. We tend to think that we can bargain with it. I will love you if, we often say implicitly in our prayer lives, if you give me this, then I will do that. So, famously, soldiers in battle pray to God and say, if you get me out of this, I'll become a priest. Whatever. And I don't think God is interested in that kind of love. He doesn't play the if-then game. God is not some kind of cosmic vending machine where we pull a lever and get a result. God wants our love all the time, no matter who we are, no matter what we are, in whatever state we are. He's interested in being in relationship with us and wants us to ask so he can give.
So allow me to probably ask very questions you've heard before, but as you said, ask so that he can give. What then are we perceiving incorrectly, when we get frustrated, when we don't receive what we believed we wanted?
Right. Well, partly sometimes it's a very good thing that we don't get what we want, because it would destroy us, make us take away all of our sense of achievement in doing anything. God knows what is going to be good for us, and he knows what's going to be bad for us. And sometimes we do ask for the wrong thing. I can think back in my life of times when I've desperately wanted something and haven't got it. And I am now so eternally thankful that I didn't, because I got something much better in the end. The other thing is, I think God always answers our prayers, even our unvoiced prayers, but not in the time frame that we anticipate. It may be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and in fact, the older I get, the more I tend to think that he may not answer the prayers in my own lifetime, that they will be answered in some other way much later on. So do we get frustrated? Sure. But as I say, we have to get away from the idea of God as a vending machine, that God will give us what we need. And I'm very much drawn to Julian Norwich's idea in the Revelations of Divine Love, where Christ says to her, I am the ground of thy beseeching. Namely, you pray because I am prompting you to pray. You don't pray in isolation or in a void. You pray only because I am urging you to pray, and I urge you to pray so that I can respond. And sometimes that response is not giving us anything. It's not the giving of a thing or a relationship or money or anything like that. It's the gift of a grace. And sometimes the grace is so that you can do without it, without what you think you absolutely need.
Do you think that attitude of acquisition is relatively modern, or have we always sought to pray and gain?
I don't think it's modern. There are modern inflections of it. Think of Janis Joplin. Lord, won't you send me a Mercedes-Benz? My friend's Porsches, I must make amends. Which is a wonderful parody of how Americans often think about prayer. It goes all the way back. And I think the tendency has been that people are taught from an early age to pray for things. Because even the Lord's Prayer says, give us our daily bread. Give us what we need, our sustenance. Which is fine. We're the kind of beings that need daily sustenance. But I think it is a better form of prayer, not to pray for good weather on the weekend, as is so common, but rather to pray for the graces that one needs in life.
Dare I ask this question? To pray for the graces one needs in life. What is it to receive grace? What does that, I don't want to say appear. How does the intentionality change when one has received grace? Maybe that'd be the better way to put it.
Okay.
Maybe I'm at fault there because I'm also asking to gain something from it in asking you that.
Well, I think when one is given a grace, which is freely given, one participates in the life of God. You're not just doing the act oneself. It may seem that you are, but many things might be deflected from impinging upon you, and you can do things in a simpler, higher way. We have experiences of this, even naturally, I think, when we're learning and a certain concept is difficult until suddenly it isn't, and you've above it, and you're working at a higher level. I think with grace, it works somewhat like that things, emotional things, relationships, problems, which have seemed so difficult, can suddenly seem apparently acausally.
Mm-hmm.
able to be working smoothly.
Well, forgive me for basically sounding like a Hegelian, but if such is the case, that this sort of acausal, what Kant would call genius, something from elsewhere has suddenly arrived, and what we might modern call a brainwave or eureka moment, something has moved and shifted. Is it? Would you possibly say that it is the case then that the history of philosophy is one of continual moments of grace that have progressed philosophical understanding?
That would be a lovely idea. Look, I hadn't thought of it quite like that. I often wonder if philosophy has ever evolved an inch.
Really? How do you mean?
Maybe it was all there incipiently in the pre-Socratics.
Thales got it right.
Hegel is basically a massive elaboration of Heraclitus, or maybe Heraclitus mixed with Parmenides. So maybe nothing has actually happened in that way. I mean, a lot depends upon the meta-philosophy that you adopt. We have at the moment a very dominant meta-philosophy. The philosophy is really a matter of argument. But, it was in the 18th century, philosophy was a matter of criticism early in the century, and then with Kant later in the century, a matter of critique. With Hegel, you just mentioned, philosophy becomes a matter of dialectic. With Husserl, philosophy becomes a matter of contemplation or reflection. And that changes the game somewhat. So I think it's always a good thing when learning philosophy to spend some time reflecting on the meta-philosophy one's being asked to consider. Is this the meta-philosophy which is really doing what philosophy does best? Is it really a matter of argument? If so, is it a matter of something close to mathematical argumentation, such as you get, as it were, in Spinoza in the Ethics, and very commonly in the more technical elements of analytic philosophy?
After Nietzsche, the meta-philosophy, do you not think it shot itself in the foot a bit? And we now struggle to walk forward at all because we're in our own recursion.
Yes, I mean, right at the end of the book, we're talking about, I put together, I juxtapose a passage from Pseudo-Dennis the Areopagite on the movements of the soul with a famous passage in Nietzsche on the death of God, where for him the death of God means that the world is just plunging eternally through darkness and moving to the left and the right and falling. And I point out that in some ways, both passages are about movement. One is about recovering this relationship with God, and the other is what happens if you don't have that relationship. That there is, as you said, no meta-philosophy, no point, no overarching solution to the question, why? And that would be for Nietzsche, nihilism.
To ask a risky question, do you believe that we can really create values in that Nietzschean void?
No, I think deep down we think I've made that up. It's all It's like what's his name, Steiner, when he said he didn't believe there were any great values, but he said we must learn to read as if. George Steiner. I thought, if I'm reading a novel and I have this idea that I must read as if the world makes sense, I'm fooling myself. And I couldn't do that. I wouldn't have the spirit to do it.
Risky question then, because you've one as if there doesn't work, but what about, I think it was Pascal's as if. What changes there?
But with the wager?
Was it Pascal who said we should live as if God exists? Wasn't Pascal? I can't remember.
Well, that would be one way of understanding the Pascalian wager. Well, I don't like that idea one little. I mean, I'm not a great. I don't engage much myself in apologetics. I certainly don't like the kind of bullying apologetics whereby you say, you've got to do this in order to have a life which is meaningful. I think it's much better to have ourselves open to the great gifts of God and learn how to receive them rather than to try to force people into having to scare people into having a relationship with God.
So, to ask an even riskier question.
Oh, you're on a roll.
Those values that have seemingly been created then out of a void that people believe they've created meaning and purpose in their life that isn't to do with God. Would you say that is obviously to do with God as a believer, but there's something in the way that disallows them to see the connection between their meaning and God?
I mean, one doesn't want to intrude too much one's own views into others' beliefs, but it would be a necessary consequence of being a believer. You'd have to say to someone who wasn't that there must be some final lack of fulfillment in their series of values, that the heart can't be stilled, can't be at peace unless there is something beyond it which forms a relationship with it.
That's interesting. So fulfillment in the modern world and generally in the lower world is usually a constant case of achieving something and then having the feeling of achievement dissipate more quickly over time as you achieve more, and then eventually fulfillment is more and more difficult. What is it that God or the task of contemplation has that allows it to have let's say, a true fulfillment?
Well, God is the only thing in reality on the Christian way of thinking which has no use value. Everything else has a use value. If I write a book, it takes up my time, it stimulates my mind, it brings in a little bit of money. I emphasize a little bit of money. But all of these things are uses. The only thing in reality that human beings have any comprehension of that doesn't have a use value is God. You can only enjoy God, not use God.
Do you think that's synonymous with unconditional love?
Yes, that comes very close to it. When we were talking earlier that we can't bargain with God, to bargain with God is a category mistake because you're trying to take something which can only be enjoyed and to treat it as though it can be used. So you only approach God in the contemplative world in order to enjoy him. Everyone who's ever written on contemplation, I think, says at some point that contemplation is delight. And it's delight because you get outside of the world of use. Even Schopenhauer, in the 18th, early 19th century, who's a profound thinker of contemplation, and not an atheist, mind you, but a devoted thinker of contemplation, particularly as it relates to the arts, said that when we contemplate a tree, we can step outside of time and outside the remorseless chains of causality and conventional morality that bind us in this world and cause all our grief. So we have moments of delight in simply contemplating a tree. And without that, he thinks human life is intolerable.
Where did he go wrong for you?
Where did it go wrong?
Yeah, for you. Where do you... Well, no, for you. Where do you see him as taking a step wrong? Does he get too caught up in his own pessimism?
Yeah, I mean, Schopenhauer thought of contemplation in an aesthetic mode only. I think there is such a thing as aesthetic contemplation that we all know. We've all had the experience of being lost when reading a narrative or watching a movie or looking at a statue or a painting, reading a poem, and you almost have to pinch yourself to come back into time. And that is aesthetic contemplation, and it's a wonderful thing. But if you limit contemplation to the aesthetic, you're removing yourself from the sheer delight of religious contemplation, where there is no use value whatsoever. It's only enjoyment.
So it's just, even thinking about it, impossible to, well, it is quite literally a leap, because it's impossible to think about something with no use value, because in thinking about it, you're sort of caught up in it, caught up in use.
Right. I mean, there are ways in which Christians do it, I must say, very commonly, that you think of God in terms of an economics, of acting nicely in order to be saved and taken to heaven. That's just an economic bet. But that would be a very vulgar understanding of Christianity. When we think about the privileged moments in our lives, which are all too few and far between, they're usually moments of intimacy with friends and family, especially with one's spouse. And when we reflect upon, now it's Christmas, and we reflect upon what's been going on earlier in the year, inevitably, it will be those moments which come to mind much more often and much more intensely than even successes at work, for example.
Do you, as we've sort of mentioned, we've mentioned Schopenhauer, we've mentioned Nietzsche, do you feel contemplation ever differs? Do you think maybe in this post-Nietzschean world it just has a bit more of a struggle to get started?
I think the interesting thing is, as modernity has gone on, we've become better attuned to seeing the different modes of contemplation. That in the Middle Ages and earlier, we thought of contemplation being contemplative prayer and being religious. And we've now started to see that there is such a thing as aesthetic contemplation, the contemplation of landscape and art, and also philosophical contemplation. The whole phenomenological movement, it seems to me, is somewhat in that camp, that Husserl recommends a mode of philosophizing which is not really to do with argumentation, but to do with contemplation and then description of what we have, which itself has fed into aesthetic contemplation with some modes of poetry and literature. And also there is scientific contemplation. The scientist at his or her work with a microscope in the lab is engaged in a certain kind of contemplation as well. And you can always tell this because time just vanishes for that person for particular hours of the day. When you're engaged in testing your hypothesis, then you are lost to the world. And that can happen in science as well as in poetry.
Do you have any advice for people to begin contemplating?
Yeah, I think everyone, all of us, regardless, can always find 15, 20 minutes out of the day. It's going to differ if one is a believer from if one's not a believer. If one's a believer, you can engage in Lectio Divina, sacred reading, for 20 minutes a day, of choosing 2 or 3 verses of the scriptures and reading them and meditating on them and praying about them, and finally being lifted up by that process to a few minutes of beholding God. If one is not religious, I think one can still gain distinct benefits from aesthetic contemplation and philosophical contemplation, of basically shedding the sheer busyness of life for a while, of settling back into yourself and making contact with the being you are, and more the being you want to be.
Mm-hmm. Is that what you would like people to take from your book?
I would. I would like them to think, I may even quote this in the book, that lovely remark of Goethe's, don't forget to live. And a lot of us in life were caught up in such hectic lives that we do forget to live. We think of work as life, and we don't actually think of the quality moments which will actually lead us into our deepest selves and into the deeper selves of those we care about.
Well, that seems to be a very smooth place to finish up. But what are you working on now?
Yes, thank you. I've finished a book just recently on Kierkegaard, which will come up with Cambridge University Press, I imagine, sometime next year. And I'm about halfway through a new book, which I'm really enjoying writing, called Phenomenology of the Christ, which is concerned with Christ, the Messiah, as a phenomenon, and also about how the Christ makes us see phenomena very differently.
Fascinating. Who are you drawing on in phenomenology text?
Well, this is interesting. I've spent all my life really reading phenomenology of one kind or another. Husserl's been very important to me all the time. But in this book, I've gone back to the Gospels in Greek to read them and to explicate certain passages of them. And my experience is that one doesn't have to do a whole lot to make the Gospels sing phenomenologically. The Greek is already doing it there, and we've just been very bad readers of what's going on in the Gospels.
I see.
I'm having the experience I was saying to a friend yesterday, as though I've never read the Gospels before. And that, I think, is a sign for me that I'm probably doing something right.
I think Edith Stein said, I think, to quote, one is never finished reading the Gospels.
Yes. I think in my own case, although I've been reading them all my life, I have the feeling I'm just about to start.
Okay. Well, I will be sure to put the links for Contemplation, the movements of the soul, in the description below, as well as our other chats. But Kevin Hart, it's been a great conversation once again, and Merry Christmas.
It's always a pleasure, James, and Merry Christmas to you.